A child's cry for help echoed in a billionaire's office, and was ignored. A barefoot, 8-year-old girl named Angela stands trembling in a billionaire's marble office, not to beg for charity, but to demand any work, scrubbing, filing, anything, to save her dying mother. Set in the gleaming, impersonal Anderson Financial Tower, the story introduces Angela, a child with hospital bands still circling her thin wrists and a heart full of desperate courage, who defies security protocols to reach Mr. Richard Anderson. While the world sees a poor kid with a sob story, the junior receptionist Marcus sees a daughter fighting for her mother's life, setting the stage for a cold rejection that will crack open both a billionaire's buried guilt and a city's conscience. Angela's sneakers squeaked against the polished marble as she approached the massive oak desk. Behind it sat Richard Anderson, his suit sharper than the edges of the skyscrapers visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He didn't look up from his tablet. "Mr. Anderson," Angela began, her voice smaller than she'd rehearsed in the elevator. "My name is Angela Brown. I'm 8 years old, and I need a job." That got his attention. His eyes lifted, cold and assessing, sweeping over her worn yellow backpack and the hospital bands circling her wrists like plastic handcuffs. "A job," he repeated, his tone flat. "Yes, sir." Angela's hands trembled as she pulled the crumpled envelope from her pocket. "My mom has cancer. Stage 4. The hospital says we have 72 hours to pay or they'll make her leave. I can clean your offices. I can organize files. I'm small, so I can reach places adults can't. I won't complain, and I don't need breaks." She laid the hospital discharge notice on his desk, the red, final warning, stamp facing him like an accusation. Richard glanced at the paper, then back at Angela. His expression never changed. He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Security, remove this child from my office." Mr. Anderson, Vanessa, his head of PR, stepped forward from where she'd been standing by the door, her voice urgent but quiet. "Vanessa." Richard's tone could have frozen fire. "If I help one, I'll have a line around the block by tomorrow. Every con artist in the city with a sick relative and a camera crew." "She's 8 years old," Vanessa whispered. "And I'm running a business, not a charity." He turned back to his tablet as 2 security guards entered. "See her out." "Gently, but out." Angela didn't fight as the guards took her arms. She looked back once at Richard Anderson, memorizing the face of the man who'd chosen a spreadsheet over her mother's life, then let herself be led away, leaving the hospital papers scattered across his perfect desk like fallen leaves. The steps of Anderson Financial Tower were cold even through Angela's jeans. She sat there because she didn't know where else to go, her yellow backpack clutched to her chest like a shield that had already failed. The sun was setting, painting the glass tower in shades of gold and red, colors too beautiful for how she felt inside. The tears came without permission, hot and choking, her small shoulders shaking with sobs she'd been holding back since her mother first collapsed. A woman in a business suit passed by, slowed, then kept walking. A man with a briefcase glanced down, frowned, and hurried faster. Then someone stopped. "Hey, sweetie, are you okay?" Angela looked up to see a young woman with a phone in her hand, concern creasing her features. Before Angela could answer, the sobs broke free again, and the words tumbled out between gasps about her mother and the hospital and the man upstairs who'd said no. The woman's expression shifted from concern to something harder. She held up her phone. "This is what happens when you ask a billionaire for help," she said, not to Angela but to her screen, to the thousands who would watch. An 8-year-old girl just got thrown out of Richard Anderson's office for asking to work to save her dying mother. This is the world we live in. Within an hour, the video had 10,000 views. Within 2, it had 1 million. By the time the sun fully set, #AndersonHeartless was trending in 47 countries, and news vans circled the tower like sharks who'd smelled blood in the water. In the 47th floor boardroom, Richard's phone vibrated with an emergency summons. His board of directors wanted answers, and they wanted them now. Angela was still on the steps, surrounded by reporters asking her to cry again for the cameras. The boardroom felt like a courtroom. 12 faces stared at Richard from around the mahogany table, their expressions ranging from nervous to furious. Vanessa stood near the presentation screen, which displayed a live feed of the trending hashtag and a graph of their plummeting stock price. 40%, she said quietly. Your approval rating has dropped 40 points in 3 hours. Richard stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, jaw set. And Martin Chen, the oldest board member, slammed his hand on the table. Richard, we have investors threatening to pull funding. Partners reconsidering contracts. This is a PR catastrophe. It's a con, Richard said flatly. Don't you see? A perfectly timed sob story, a viral video, public outrage. My competitors have been trying to damage us for months. This is Victor Chen's work, I guarantee it. That child is 8 years old, Vanessa said, her voice strained. Which makes her the perfect prop. Richard's eyes were hard. I built this company from nothing. From a group home where we ate expired donated food and wore second-hand clothes that never fit. I clawed my way here because I learned the most important lesson early: everyone wants something from you. The moment you give in, you become a target. So your solution is to do nothing? Another board member asked. My solution is to not be manipulated. Richard's voice rose. If I help one, I'll have a line around the block tomorrow. Every sob story in this city, every con artist with a camera, every person who thinks my money is their right. I don't owe anyone my wealth because they have a sad story. Vanessa stepped forward, her phone in her hand. Richard, please. Just look at the messages. People are calling for boycotts. They're protesting outside. This girl is not my responsibility. He turned toward the door. I survived without handouts. So can she. He walked out, leaving them in stunned silence, his muttered words trailing behind him, vultures and frauds, every one of them. The penthouse was too quiet. Richard stood at the window overlooking the city, watching the news helicopters circle his building like vultures. He'd been right about that word, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages he wouldn't read. Sleep wouldn't come. It never did after board meetings like that. He poured himself a scotch, then set it down untouched. His feet carried him to the walk-in closet, to the back corner where boxes he hadn't opened in years gathered dust. Tax documents. Old contracts. Things from before. One box, smaller than the others, had no label. Richard pulled it down, his hands steadier than they'd been all day until he opened the lid. Inside were fragments of a life he'd tried to forget, a worn baseball mitt, a participation ribbon from a school race, a letter of acceptance to Fairmont Academy with its gold-embossed seal. And beneath it all, a photograph. 2 boys, maybe 10 years old, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. They stood in front of a brick building with a faded sign, St. Mary's Home for Children. Both wore donated clothes that didn't quite fit. Both had the same hollow-cheeked look of kids who never got quite enough. Richard turned the photograph over. On the back, in careful child's handwriting, Richard and Danny, brothers forever. St. Mary's Orphanage, 1989. His hands began to shake. Danny. Daniel Brown. The name hit him like a physical blow. Angela Brown. She'd said her name was Angela Brown. Richard sank to the floor, the photograph clutched in his trembling fingers, and for the first time in 20 years, Richard Anderson, self-made billionaire, corporate titan, fortress of a man, felt the walls around his heart begin to crack. Richard didn't sleep. By dawn, he'd made 17 phone calls, and by noon, a private investigator named Carla Matthews sat across from him, sliding a manila folder across his desk. Daniel Brown, she said. Died 2 years ago in a workplace accident at Morton's Auto Repair. Faulty lift. The company settled out of court, but after legal fees and existing medical debt from his wife Grace's first cancer treatment, there wasn't much left. Richard's hands tightened on the folder. And Angela? Grace Brown was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 8 months ago. Treatment depleted their savings. Angela Brown, age 8, has been functioning as primary caregiver, cooking, cleaning, managing medications. She's missed 43 days of school this semester. The folder contained photographs. Angela at a playground, pushing a younger child on a swing, her smile bright despite everything. Angela at a grocery store, counting coins at the register. Angela asleep on a hospital chair, her head on her mother's bed. And one photograph that made Richard's breath catch, Daniel Brown holding a newborn, his face radiant with joy. The same face from St. Mary's, older but still recognizably Danny, still with that same open smile that believed the world could be good. The hospital discharge was real, Carla continued. Grace Brown was moved to St. Catherine's homeless shelter yesterday after the 72-hour deadline expired. According to my sources, she has maybe 2 weeks without treatment. With treatment. She paused. 6 months, maybe a year. Richard stared at the photograph of Danny holding baby Angela. His brother, because that's what they'd been, what they'd promised to be, cradling the daughter Richard had turned away. The deadline, Richard said hoarsely. You said it expired yesterday? The hospital's deadline, yes. But Mr. Anderson, without intervention, the real deadline is much sooner. Carla stood. Street Catherine's address is in the folder. What you do with it is your choice. After she left, Richard sat alone in his office, surrounded by the monuments to his success, awards, photos with presidents and CEOs, a view that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. All of it built on the back of a lie he'd told himself for 20 years, that leaving Danny behind had been survival, not cowardice. His hands were shaking again as he grabbed his coat. The real deadline was tonight, and Richard Anderson was 20 years late. St. Catherine's homeless shelter smelled like industrial cleaner trying to hide desperation. Richard stood in the doorway, his $1,000 suit drawing stares from residents who shuffled past carrying plastic bags of belongings. A nun approached, her face kind but wary. I'm looking for Grace and Angela Brown, Richard said. And you are? Someone who should have come sooner. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward a hallway. Room 7. But sir. That little girl has been through enough. Whatever you're selling, whatever you want from them. I'm not selling anything. Richard's voice cracked. I'm trying to buy back something I lost a long time ago. Room 7 was barely larger than a closet. 2 cots, a shared nightstand, a single lamp. Grace Brown lay on one cot, skeletal and pale, her breathing shallow. Angela sat beside her on a plastic chair, reading aloud from a tattered copy of Where the Wild Things Are. And Max said, Let the wild rumpus start. Angela's voice carried forced cheer, trying to bring life to a room saturated with death. Richard knocked softly on the open door. Angela looked up, and recognition flashed across her face, not warmth, but the cold acknowledgement of someone who'd already learned the world's cruelest lessons. Her grip tightened on the book. Did you come to film this for your PR team? Her voice was steady, but her eyes were ancient. Is that what you need? To see how we're doing so you can tell the cameras you checked? Angela. Because we're fine, Mr. Anderson. She turned back to her mother, whose eyes remained closed. We don't need your pity or your photo op. We needed your help 3 days ago, and you said no. So you can go now. Richard stepped into the room, his throat tight. I know I can't undo what I did. But I need to tell you something. Don't. Angela's voice broke for the first time. Don't you dare talk about my dad. You don't know anything about him. His name was Daniel Brown. Danny. And he was my best friend. Angela's head snapped up, confusion replacing anger. What? Richard pulled the photograph from his pocket, his hands trembling as he held it out. We grew up together. At St. Mary's. We were supposed to be brothers forever. Richard knelt beside Angela's cot, the photograph between them like a bridge across 20 years of absence. Angela stared at the image of the two boys, her finger tracing the careful handwriting on the back. "That's my dad," she whispered. "He's the one on the right. I can tell from his smile." "Yes." Richard's voice was raw. He had the best smile. He could make anyone feel like they mattered, like the world was better just because they were in it. "Then why?" Angela looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you say no to me? If you were his friend, why didn't you help?" The question shattered something in Richard's chest. "Because I'm a coward. Because I've spent 20 years running from the worst thing I ever did, and I didn't recognize that I was about to do it again." He told her everything. The scholarship. The promise he'd made and broken. How he'd convinced himself that leaving Danny behind was survival when it was really betrayal. How he'd built walls so high around his heart that he couldn't see an 8-year-old girl bleeding on his office floor. "When I was your age, I learned that the world is cruel and that you have to be harder than it is to survive. But your father, Danny, taught me something different. He taught me that being kind wasn't weakness. And I forgot. I forgot for so long that when you walked into my office, I saw a threat instead of a child. I saw a con instead of courage." Richard pulled a folder from his coat, his hands shaking as he placed it in Angela's small ones. "I can't bring your father back. I can't give you the 20 years I stole from him by not being the brother I promised to be. But I can do this." He opened the folder. "Full medical coverage for your mother. The best doctors, the best treatment. A trust fund for your education, college, graduate school, whatever you want. And..." He pulled out the final document, the one that had taken 3 lawyers and 6 hours to draft. "A letter of adoption intent. If your mother agrees, if you agree, I want to be your family." Angela stared at the papers, her lips trembling. "Why? Why now?" "Because your father deserved better from me. Because you deserve better from the world. And because..." Richard's voice broke. "Because I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for the chance to become the man your father thought I was. The man he saw in that photograph when we were 10 years old and still believed in things like brothers forever." Grace Brown's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on Richard's face. "You're him," she whispered. "Danny talked about you. Richie from St. Mary's. He never stopped hoping you'd call." The words were a knife, but Richard didn't turn away. "I know. And I'm so sorry." Angela looked from Richard to her mother and back again, the folder heavy in her hands, containing the promise of a future she'd stopped believing in 3 days ago on a marble office floor. "My dad used to say everyone deserves a second chance," she finally said. "But he also said you have to earn it." "I will," Richard promised. "Every single day." Angela nodded slowly, then did something Richard didn't expect. She reached out and took his hand. "Okay," she said. "Let's try." 6 months later. The penthouse Richard had spent 20 years perfecting looked nothing like it used to. The sterile white walls were now covered in Angela's artwork, finger paintings and crayon drawings that brought color to spaces that had forgotten what warmth looked like. The formal dining table that had hosted business dinners now bore the marks of homework sessions and art projects. The view of the city remained, but now Richard saw it differently, not as a kingdom he'd conquered, but as a neighborhood where people like Grace and Angela lived and struggled and hoped. Grace sat at the kitchen counter, her hair growing back in soft curls, reviewing applications for the Daniel Brown Foundation's volunteer coordinator position she'd already accepted. She was in remission. The best doctors, the experimental treatment, the round-the-clock care had bought them the miracle they'd needed. She looked up and smiled as Richard entered. "Angela's waiting for you." Bedtime story. Richard found Angela in her room, a space that had once been his home gym and was now a forest of bookshelves and star-shaped lights. She sat on her bed, that same tattered copy of Where the Wild Things Are, in her hands. "Your turn to read," she said, handing him the book as he settled beside her. Richard opened to the first page, his voice soft in the lamplight. "The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another." "Richard?" Angela interrupted. "Yeah. Do you think my dad would be mad at you?" The question he'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. Richard set the book down, his eyes stinging. "Every day," he said honestly. "Every single day I think about what I owe him, what I stole from him by not being there. Mom says he would have forgiven you." Angela leaned against his shoulder. "She says he was like that. He always saw the best in people. He did. Even when they didn't deserve it. But I think—" Angela was quiet for a moment. "I think he'd be proud you're trying. That's what he always told me, it's not about never messing up. It's about what you do after." Richard wrapped his arm around her, this child who'd saved him as much as he'd saved her. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn that." "I know." Angela picked up the book again. "Now finish the story. The wild things are waiting." So Richard read, his voice carrying through the penthouse that had finally become a home, reading about a boy who sailed away and came back to find his supper waiting for him, still hot. Outside the window, the city glittered with a million lights, each one a story, each one a chance to choose differently than before. And in a photograph on Angela's nightstand, two boys smiled forever in a moment before everything changed, a promise written on the back in careful child's handwriting, brothers forever. Richard was 20 years late in keeping that promise. But he was keeping it now.